You've heard the headlines, right? China's economy is in free fall, the miracle is over, a crash is coming. It's everywhere. But what if that's not the whole story? What if we're all missing the real game plan that's unfolding? Well, today, we're going to dig into that. Let's find out what's really going on.
For years, this has been the go-to comparison, what some people call the Japan narrative. You know the one, the idea that China is just repeating the same mistakes Japan made in the 90s and that it's heading for its own lost decade. It's a really powerful and frankly pretty scary story that's been shaping how a lot of people see things.
But here's the big question. What if that comparison is just wrong? What if the slowdown we're all seeing isn't a sign of some epic collapse, but is actually a deliberate, strategic move? That's the fascinating idea we're going to unpack right now. So, to really get what's happening, you have to look beyond that one big, flashy GDP number. It seems China is changing its entire economic playbook. They're moving away from an obsession with speed and growth at all costs to a much more careful focus on structure.
Yeah, just look at the difference here. The old game was pretty simple. Just hit that big growth target, whatever it takes. But the new game? It's way more complex. It's about making specific parts of the economy stronger and, this is a big one, being smarter about how wealth gets distributed. It's a massive shift from pure quantity to quality.
So what does structural actually mean day to day? Well, it's things like extending Social Security to cover gig economy workers, or handing out subsidies to help families with childcare. And then there's the high-tech side, pouring a ton of money into what they're calling new productive forces. We're talking AI, commercial spaceflight, next-gen robotics, the whole shebang.
And this new focus has led to a really interesting way of managing the economy. It's no longer about just slamming your foot on the gas pedal. Instead, it's more like they're trying to keep the engine running at that perfect temperature.
This quote right here, this is basically the entire playbook in one sentence. If the economy starts to slow down too much, the government steps in and gives it a little boost. But, and this is the new part, if it starts to grow too fast, they actually pull back and let it cool down a bit. The goal isn't just explosive growth anymore, it's all about managed stability. Okay, let's look at 2024 as a perfect example. The year started out pretty strong, but then you see that dip mid-year. So what happened? The government stepped in with some targeted policies, gave it a little nudge, and boom, growth pops right back up by the end of the year. That is the prop-up phase in action.
Now, let's flip the script and look at 2025. Here, the economy came out of the gate hot, really strong. The old playbook would have been to pour more fuel on the fire. But instead, they did the opposite. They gently tapped the brakes and allowed things to cool off. That's that ease-off principle we were just talking about.
So the most important thing to grasp here is that China seems to be actively trading raw speed for stability. They're trying to navigate this incredibly tricky transition from a young, high-growth economy to a more mature, sustainable one. And they seem to believe that a steady, moderate growth path is the safest way to get there.
But this whole strategy isn't just happening in a bubble. Chinese planners believe they have a huge, maybe even overlooked, advantage on the global stage. And it has to do with these massive, long-term economic cycles. It's centered on a big economic theory called the Kondratiev cycle. Now, it sounds super academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It suggests that global economies move in these really long waves or seasons of boom and bust, each one lasting around 60 years. And right now, the theory is that the global economy is in a low-growth winter or a depression phase. And this is where timing is everything. Think about it. China's incredible industrial boom happened in the 2000s, right in the middle of a global prosperity phase, an economic summer, when the world could easily absorb all that growth. Now compare that to Argentina, which tried a similar push back in the 70s, during a global depression phase. It just didn't work. The global conditions weren't right. So the argument is, because we're in one of those global down cycles right now, no other country can realistically build a manufacturing base to challenge China's. I mean, look at this number. 1,000 trillion RMB. That's the estimated cost to replicate what China built. In today's fragile world economy, trying to invest that kind of money would just spark runaway inflation. It's almost impossible.
At the very same time, the world's #1 consumer, the United States, can't seem to stop spending. As U.S. government deficits keep getting bigger, so does its appetite for imported goods. And even with tariffs, that demand just finds a way, often getting rerouted through places like Mexico or Vietnam, which are, in many cases, just selling repackaged Chinese goods.
Okay, so this brings us to what might be the single biggest reason that Japan narrative doesn't quite fit. It's not just about government policy or global timing. It's about a fundamental difference in the very DNA of China's economy. People are calling it the industrial base model, and it's so much more than just having a lot of factories. You have to imagine it like a vast, deeply interconnected ecosystem, where different industries are constantly feeding off of each other, sparking all kinds of unexpected innovations.
Let me show you how this works. A key part of it is something called collateral supply, where a massive industry creates these surprise advantages for a totally different one. For instance, because China mines so much copper and lead, it actually gets over 85% of its silver pretty much for free, just as a byproduct. Or think about this. All those years of R&D making phone batteries smaller and better? That created the foundation for companies like BYD to make huge breakthroughs in electric vehicle batteries.
Here is a wild, real-world example. A company called Dream Technology, famous for making robotic vacuum cleaners, is now getting into making cars. How on earth does that happen? It's because being plugged into this massive industrial base gives them access to tech, supply chains, and talent from completely different fields. This kind of cross-pollination is something Japan in the 90s just didn't have. So, when you start putting all these pieces together, the big shift in strategy, the timing of the global cycle, and this incredibly unique industrial base, a very, very different picture of China's economy starts to emerge. And that really brings us to the core takeaway from this whole analysis. The moderate growth we're seeing today isn't necessarily the start of a lost decade. Instead, you can see it as a deliberate, calculated trade-off. It's the price they're willing to pay for what they call strategic stability during this huge transition.
Of course, this isn't the final word. This whole perspective just brings up a new set of critical questions. Is this transition really going to take a decade? Can China actually succeed in shifting its entire economy to rely more on its own consumers? And for the rest of the world, how should we adapt to this new reality? It seems the only thing we know for sure is that the old stories might not be the right ones anymore.